even put this book down all morning.
Me neither. It's perfect for today's episode.
Let's get everything set up in the studio.
Welcome back to another episode of Deep Dive. Let's dive right into it today.
So, usually when we talk about scientific progress, there's this underlying expectation of just absolute precision, right?
Like perfectly clean answers.
Exactly. You think of engineering or maybe orthopedics. Like if you fall off a ladder, you go to the hospital, they take an x-ray of your arm and you see that jagged white line on the black background.
Right. It's right there in front of you.
Yeah. The doctor just points to it and says, there it is. That's the problem. It's beautifully binary. I mean, it's either broken or it's not.
Well, we inherently prefer things to be visible. Human beings just want reality categorized, neatly put into little boxes, and backed up by empirical, undeniable evidence that we can see with our own eyes.
But then you step into the world of neuroscience and cognitive science and human consciousness, and suddenly that X-ray machine, that whole desire for simple, visible proof, it just feels entirely inadequate.
It really does. It falls apart.
Because, you look at a functional MRI scan and you see a patch of the brain light up with vibrant red and yellow pixels, and a researcher tells you, there it is, that's the feeling of love.
Right. Or they say, that patch of pixels, that's your belief in God.
Yes.
Huh.
And we go from the clarity of a broken bone to this incredibly murky diagnostic landscape. We're looking at the physical shadows of something deeply immaterial, and we're being asked to pretend that the shadow is the actual object itself.
Which is, it's the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Totally.
And this is actually the central tension we're tackling today. So we are exploring the second half, specifically chapters 6 through 10 of a truly remarkable book. It's called God on the Brain: What Cognitive Science Does and Does Not Tell Us About Faith, Human Nature, and the Divine.
Such a good title.
It is. And the author is Bradley Sickler. Just to give you some context on his credentials, he holds a PhD from Purdue University. He serves as an associate professor of philosophy, and he's the program director for the Master of Arts in Theological Studies program over at the University of Northwestern in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Okay, so he's not messing around.
Not at all. He brings this incredibly rigorous blend of hard science, heavy-duty philosophy, and just really rich theological insight to this specific problem.
Which brings us to you, our listener. We are unpacking an absolute mind-bender today, and we are just thrilled you're here with us as the third person in this conversation.
Grab a cup of coffee for this one.
Seriously, you'll need it. The core question we're going to explore today is massive. Does modern cognitive science and neuroscience actually eliminate the need for the human soul, for human free will, and ultimately for God?
Or do these scientific discoveries, surprisingly, point right back to those very concepts?
Okay, let's unpack this, because I feel like we really have to start with the most fundamental question of human nature. Like, are we just highly evolved animals, or is there something fundamentally different about us?
Right, because when you look at the biological world, you see this astonishing array of life. And it's true that we share a tremendous amount of physical makeup with the animal kingdom.
Sure, yeah.
We share carbon, oxygen, the biological need for water, for sleep. We actually share roughly 97% of our DNA with chimpanzees.
97%? That's a lot.
It is. And because of this undeniable biological overlap, there is this really pervasive narrative in our modern secular culture that humans are merely highly evolved animals. The argument goes that we are just a little higher on the evolutionary ladder than the great apes.
Just difference in degree, not in kind.
Exactly. Rather than what the biblical worldview asserts, which is that we are uniquely created in the divine image, that we are distinct in kind.
Yeah, because when scientists study the prefrontal cortex of humans and then they compare it to monkeys, they often use language that kind of suggests we're just on the extreme end of an ape continuum.
Right.
But Sickler points out how absurd that reduction is when you actually look at the output of human life. It's one thing to say a chimpanzee can use a stick to fish ants out of a stump.
That shows tool use, sure.
Sure. But chimpanzees aren't, building the Mars rover. They aren't composing symphonies or writing romantic poetry or building these towering cathedrals to worship a transcendent God.
No, they're definitely not doing that.
So the gap between primate behavior and human civilization isn't just a slight step up, it's an incomprehensible chasm.
It really is. And what's fascinating here is how the secular academy attempts to just wave away this massive chasm. They rely heavily on what we can call the progress of science argument, or the PSA.
Okay, break that down for us. What is the PSA?
Well, the narrative is essentially a historical fable. It goes something like this. In the bad old days, ignorant, primitive people didn't understand the world, so they blamed lightning on angry sky gods.
Right, like Zeus throwing thunderbolts.
Exactly. They thought droughts were divine curses. But then the scientific revolution came along. We discovered meteorology, atmospheric pressure, tectonic plates, and the progress of science steadily squeezed the gods out of the natural world, replacing superstition with mechanism.
Okay, I track with that historical narrative.
But now, the argument claims, science is doing the exact same thing to the human soul.
Oh, I see. So the implication is that we used to think there was this mystical spirit pulling the strings of the human body, but now we have functional MRIs, we have detailed brain scans.
Yeah, we've mapped the human genome and the neural pathways.
Right.
The philosopher Gilbert Ryle actually captured this perfectly and really dismissively when he called the soul the dogma of the ghost in the machine.
The ghost in the machine. Wow.
Yeah. The physicalist agenda claims that as we understand more and more about neurons and synapses and the whole electrochemical soup of brain chemistry, the ghost is essentially being served an eviction notice. They argue there's simply no explanatory work left for a soul to do. Everything can be explained by physics and chemistry.
Yeah, wait, isn't this just the soul of the gaps argument? Ancient people blaming lightning on angry gods because they didn't know about static electricity. Are materialists accusing us of just blaming consciousness on a soul simply because we don't fully understand the brain yet?
That is precisely the accusation being leveled.
It feels like they're accusing dualists, people who believe humans possess both a physical body and an immaterial soul, of just being intellectually lazy.
Yes, they are saying that invoking the soul is a stopgap for scientific ignorance. But that completely misrepresents why dualists believe in the soul in the first place. We don't hold to the existence of the soul just to plug a gap in a neurobiological equation. We believe in it because of our direct, undeniable first-person experience of reality, and fundamentally because of divine revelation.
Right.
But even on a purely philosophical level, Sickler demonstrates that this progress of science argument collapses the second it encounters what the philosopher David Chalmers coined as the hard problem of consciousness.
Okay, I want to spend some time on this because the hard problem is such a crucial concept. Can you break down what Chalmers means by this? Because he differentiates between the easy problems of the brain and the hard problem, right?
Yeah, Chalmers points out that neuroscience is actually brilliant at solving the easy problems. Now, easy is a relative term here. Mechanically, they are incredibly complex.
Right. Brain surgery isn't exactly easy.
Yeah, not at all. But an easy problem in this context is something like, how does the visual cortex process the light bouncing off an apple? How does the brain send motor signals to the muscles in your arm to reach out and grab that apple?
Okay, so just tracing the circuitry.
Exactly. We can map those physical structures. Yeah. We can trace the electrochemical signals. They are puzzles of engineering. But the hard problem is in an entirely different category.
So what's the hard problem?
The hard problem is explaining why and how those physical mechanical processes give rise to a subjective conscious experience.
Because knowing the mechanism doesn't explain the experience.
Precisely.
Let me use an analogy. If I accidentally hit my thumb with a hammer, a neuroscientist can trace the exact electrical impulse traveling up my arm, entering the spinal cord, and firing off C fibers in my brain.
Right, they can map the entire chain reaction.
But knowing that physical C fibers are firing in a specific sequence does absolutely nothing to explain the actual feeling of pain, the sheer agonizing first-person reality of a throbbing thumb.
Exactly. Or consider the profound feeling of awe when you look at a starry sky, or the visceral grief of losing a loved one.
Yeah.
A thought is not a collection of neurons. A feeling is not an electrical charge. The chemical mechanism itself does not possess the property of awe or grief or pain.
Right. Carbon and water don't have feelings.
No, they don't. So at the end of the day, when you ask a strict materialist why a specific arrangement of gray matter suddenly generates the subjective feeling of being alive, what philosophers call qualia, their only answer is essentially, well, it just does. When matter gets complicated enough, consciousness just magically emerges.
That's not really a scientific answer. That's magic.
It is. There is a massive explanatory gap there. Therefore, the claim that science has eliminated the soul because it has explained everything is demonstrably false. Science hasn't even begun to explain the hard problem of consciousness. It can't even get out of the starting block.
Okay, but let me push back on this. Because if we admit there is a hard problem, the materialist skeptic is immediately going to pivot to the physical laws of the universe.
Oh, they always do.
Yeah. The classic objection I always hear is about the conservation of energy. Like, if you claim an immaterial soul exists and it controls the physical body, how does a soul which has absolutely no physical mass interact with a physical brain?
The interaction problem.
Right. Doesn't that break the most basic laws of physics? Because if a soul decides to lift an arm and it causes a physical neuron to fire, it would have to inject energy into the physical universe from the outside, right? Energy can't just appear out of nowhere.
This is perhaps the most common objection to dualism. But Sickler dismantles it by showing it actually fails on two very distinct, scientifically rigorous fronts.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, we have to look closely at the law of conservation of energy itself. This law states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred.
Right, middle school physics.
But, and this is the crucial caveat, the law applies strictly and only to closed systems. By definition, if a human being is a body-soul union, the physical brain is not a closed system.
Oh.
It is designed to be open to the immaterial soul. So, applying the laws of a closed thermodynamic system to the brain-soul interaction is a fundamental category error. It's like trying to apply the rules of chess to a game of poker.
Wow, that makes perfect logical sense. If the system was designed by a creator to be open, then crying foul based on closed system rules is it's missing the point entirely.
Exactly.
But you mentioned a second front to this refutation.
I did. And this is where the physics gets incredibly fascinating, because modern physics actually turns that classical billiard ball view of causation completely on its head.
Okay, how so?
Well, materialists are heavily relying on a 19th century Newtonian view of physics to argue against the soul. They view the universe as a giant machine of colliding physical parts. But in the 20th century, physics underwent a massive revolution with general relativity and quantum mechanics.
Right, Einstein and all that?
Yes. For instance, in Einstein's theory of general relativity, gravitational energy cannot be defined locally. Because space-time itself is curving, energy is not conserved in the traditional local sense that materialists demand.
Wait, so even something as fundamental as gravity breaks the classical rules of energy conservation that they are using to disprove the soul?
Precisely. And it gets even wilder when we zoom into quantum mechanics.
Oh boy.
There's this deeply established principle known as Bell's theorem. Now, without getting bogged down in the math, Bell's theorem proves the existence of non-local correlations between quantum states, completely without any exchange of energy whatsoever.
Okay, you might have to give me an analogy for that one.
Imagine having two magic dice on opposite sides of the universe. If you roll a 6 on one, the other die instantly becomes a 6. They affect each other's state instantaneously across vast distances, faster than the speed of light, with absolutely zero physical energy transferring between them.
That is insane.
It is. This phenomenon, quantum entanglement, is an accepted reality of modern physics.
Okay, so the universe already allows for cause and effect to happen without any physical energy transfer.
Yes. So if modern cutting-edge physics tells us that physical causation can happen without energy transfer at the quantum level, how can a materialist dogmatically claim that an immaterial soul cannot affect a physical brain without an energy transfer?
They can't.
Right. Science simply cannot forbid the causal interaction of the immaterial mind and the physical body. The materialists are using outdated physics to rule out the soul, while quantum physics is showing us that reality is far more mysterious, open, and just less strictly mechanical than the 19th century scientists ever imagined.
So they're demanding a physical wire between the brain and the soul, while physics is proving that the universe operates on wireless connections.
I love that analogy, yes.
But okay, the materialist has one more major argument against the soul, and honestly, this one feels much more grounded in everyday experience. Sickler calls it the slight changes argument, or the argument from correlations.
Right, this is the argument that points to the deep dependency the mind has on the physical brain.
Yeah, the materialist says if the soul is truly separate from the brain, why does brain damage change who you are?
Exactly. Why does a tumor alter your personality? Why does Alzheimer's seemingly erase your memories? Heck, why does a strong cup of coffee or a lack of sleep profoundly change your mental state?
Right. They look at someone who suffers a stroke and loses the ability to speak or comprehend language, and they conclude, see, the mind is just the brain. Because if there were a soul sitting in the driver's seat, This tight dependency would be highly surprising. The soul should just keep thinking clearly, regardless of the brain's physical state.
Right.
How does Sickler address this? Because honestly, it's a really intuitive objection.
It is, but Sickler addresses this by demanding we differentiate between subjective probability and objective probability.
Meaning what?
The materialist is saying it is surprising to them if dualism is true. But that surprise is just a subjective feeling. It's a psychological report of their own personal incredulity, not a mathematical or scientific fact.
Oh, I see.
The materialist is assuming that if God gave us souls, those souls should float around independently of the body, completely unaffected by physical trauma.
Yeah.
But by what standard are they assuming that?
That's a great point. We act like discovering the brain affects the mind is some brand new neuroscience revelation, Like we just figured it out in the 1990s with MRI machines.
Right.
But historically, dualists have never believed the soul was unaffected by the body. Sickler points out that the Edwin Smith papyrus from the 16th century BC ancient Egypt documented exactly how head injuries caused specific neurological and behavioral deficits.
Yeah, they've known this for millennia.
Hippocrates and Galen in the ancient Greco-Roman world wrote extensively about how traumatic brain injury altered human behavior.
We see this throughout the history of philosophy as well. Look at René Descartes in the 17th century. I mean, he is perhaps the most famous proponent of mind-body dualism in history. Yet, Descartes explicitly rejected the idea that the soul was just hovering inside the body.
Didn't he have a specific phrase for that?
He did. In his writings, he explicitly stated that he was not merely present in his body like a sailor in a ship.
A sailor in a ship?
Yeah, because a sailor isn't physically damaged when his ship hits a rock. He just steers it differently. Descartes argued that the soul and body are deeply and substantially united, heavily intermingled. He knew full well that physical damage impeded mental function.
Okay, so dualists have always known that the brain affects the mind. The fact that a stroke alters personality doesn't disprove the soul. It just proves that the body and soul are intimately connected.
Exactly.
And this brings us right to the theological framework. The biblical worldview doesn't teach that we are just ghosts driving meat suits. That's a Greek philosophical idea, not a biblical one.
No, the biblical understanding of human nature is that we are a holistic body-soul union. In Genesis, God formed man from the dust of the ground, the physical, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, the immaterial, and man became a living creature.
We are meant to be embodied.
Right. When theologians look at models of divine action in the world, there is this incredibly helpful concept called concurrentism.
Concurrentism?
Yeah, this is the idea that God's sovereign, sustaining action and the natural laws of the universe operate concurrently. When a seed grows into a tree, it is following natural biological laws, but God is concurrently willing and sustaining that growth. They cooperate. They don't compete.
So, in the exact same way, the immaterial soul and the physical brain operate concurrently.
Yes.
It isn't either the brain doing the work or the soul doing the work. It is both, working together by divine design. Like, if you have a brilliantly skilled pianist, but you give them a piano with broken keys, the music will sound distorted.
That's a perfect analogy.
The pianist hasn't lost their skill. The physical instrument is impeding the expression of that skill. The fact that an injured brain limits the soul's expression in the physical world is exactly what we would expect from a tightly unified, concurrent design.
It neutralizes the materialist's surprise completely.
Yeah.
The data fits perfectly within the Christian anthropology of a unified body and soul.
Yeah.
But Sickler pushes the narrative further because if we accept the materialist premise that the mind is entirely dependent on the physical brain and that you are only physical matter, it leads to a truly terrifying question about human agency.
Okay, where does it lead?
If our brains are just chemistry, do we actually have free will or are we just reading a chemical script?
Oh man, this moves us into the metaphysics of freedom, which Sickler covers in Chapter 8. Let's follow the materialist logic to its inevitable end. If you are only matter, you are subject exclusively to the laws of physics.
Right. This is known in philosophy as the consequence argument, and it forms the bedrock of hard determinism.
The consequence argument?
Yeah, it goes like this. If your mental states are nothing more than physical brain states, and your brain states are nothing more than physical matter subject to the inflexible laws of physics, then every single choice you make is the inevitable consequence of the state of the universe right before you made it, combined with the laws of nature.
Wow.
You don't control the past, the Big Bang, and the evolutionary history of the cosmos, and you don't control the laws of physics. Therefore, you have absolutely zero control over your choices.
That is incredibly bleak. It basically says that my decision to drink coffee instead of tea this morning was determined billions of years ago by the trajectory of subatomic particles.
That is exactly what it says.
But this isn't just an abstract philosophical game, right? Secular neuroscientists actively embrace this. Let's talk about the experiments that seem to back this up.
They absolutely embrace it, and they use data to justify it. The most famous examples are the experiments conducted by Benjamin Libet in the 1980s.
Oh, the Libet experiments.
Yeah, Libet hooked subjects up to an EEG to measure their brain waves. He asked them to perform a simple motor task, like pressing a button or flexing their wrist, whenever they felt the urge to do so. They were watching a specialized clock and were asked to note the exact millisecond they felt the conscious urge to move.
Okay, so he's tracking the moment of conscious decision-making versus the physical action.
Right, but what Libet found was startling. The EEG showed a buildup of neurological activity in the motor cortex, what he called a readiness potential, about 300 milliseconds before the subject reported feeling the conscious urge to move.
So the brain was gearing up for action before the person even knew they wanted to act.
Exactly. And modern neuroscience has pushed this much further. Recent fMRI studies have shown that researchers, by monitoring brain activity, can predict which of two buttons a subject will press a full 7 to 10 seconds before the subject is consciously aware of making the decision.
Wait, 7 to 10 seconds?
Yes.
If my brain chemistry is committing to a decision 10 seconds before I actually feel like I've made the choice, isn't my entire sense of free will just a user interface illusion?
That's the argument.
It's like a little kid sitting in the passenger seat of a car with a plastic steering wheel. The kid turns the plastic wheel, the car turns, and the kid thinks, I'm driving.
Oh, I've seen kids do that.
Right. But the parent is actually steering the real wheel.
Well,
In this scenario, my conscious mind is the kid with the plastic wheel, and my brain chemistry is the parent actually driving.
that is exactly how prominent atheist neuroscientists interpret the data. Sam Harris takes this to its logical conclusion and famously refers to human beings as biomechanical puppets.
Biomechanical puppets.
He argues that free will is a complete illusion. You can do what you decide to do, but you cannot decide what you will decide to do. The neurochemistry dictates the decision, and consciousness is just along for the ride.
But wait, if I'm just a biomechanical puppet, how can our justice system punish criminals? If a murderer's brain chemistry made the decision 10 seconds before they were conscious of it, based on the laws of physics they couldn't control, how can we hold them morally responsible?
The short answer from the hard determinist is, you can't, not in any ultimate moral sense.
They're kidding.
No, they argue that the justice system shouldn't be about retribution or moral guilt, but simply about quarantining dangerous machines to protect society, like putting a defective car in the junkyard.
That's chilling.
It is. And this debate brings us to the great philosophical divide regarding human freedom, libertarianism versus compatibilism. And to be clear, we are talking about metaphysical libertarianism here, not the political party.
Right. Let's define those terms because they are crucial to Sickler's argument.
Okay. Libertarian freedom is the idea that human beings possess the power of contrary choice. It's the power to stop or go. If you could perfectly rewind the tape of the universe to the exact moment you made a decision, keeping all the atoms and circumstances exactly the same, you could have chosen differently.
Okay, that's what most people think of when they hear free will.
Exactly. Compatibilism, on the other hand, says that human choices are determined by prior causes. You couldn't have chosen otherwise. But you're still acting freely because you are doing what you desire to do.
Yeah.
Your freedom is compatible with being determined.
Let me make sure I grasp the compatibilist view. If I go to a restaurant and I really desire a steak and I order the steak, I'm acting freely under compatibilism because nobody held a gun to my head.
Right.
But my desire for the steak was determined by millions of years of evolution, my genetics, my upbringing, and my brain chemistry. I chose what I wanted, but I didn't program my wants.
Exactly. You are acting according to your greatest desire in that moment. But those desires are determined. Now, here is where we find a massive, almost humorous irony that Sickler highlights.
Oh, I love a good irony.
Materialist scientists like Sam Harris are forced to embrace determinism and compatibilism because they believe blind physics dictates everything.
Right?
But historically, Orthodox Christians have also embraced compatibilism, not because of blind physics, but because of God's meticulous, purposeful sovereignty.
Wow, this is such a fascinating convergence. The secular materialist is having an existential crisis because they realize their conscious mind isn't the ultimate author of their destiny. But the believer looks at that and says, we've known we aren't in ultimate control for 2,000 years.
Yes. The biblical worldview is beautifully robust here.
It really is. The scripture is filled with language that affirms both God's absolute sovereignty over all things and man's responsibility for his actions. Let's dive into the specific scriptural anchors here.
Let's do it. When you look at the Gospel of John, Jesus makes a profound statement about the nature of the human will and salvation. In John chapter 6, verse 44, Jesus says, "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him."
Wow.
We do not initiate our salvation out of some autonomous libertarian free will. We are drawn by a sovereign act of God.
The Apostle Paul unpacks this extensively, too. In Ephesians chapter 1, verses 4-5, he writes that God chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and blameless before him. In love, he predestined us for adoption to himself as sons through Jesus Christ, according to the purpose of his will.
Right.
It is God's eternal decree that determines the outcome, not human autonomy.
And perhaps the most stunning and challenging passage on this is Romans chapter 9. Paul actually anticipates the exact argument that the modern person makes against compatibilism.
He knew what they were going to say.
He did. People read about predestination and say, wait, if God determines our choices, how can he hold us responsible? That's not fair. How can he find fault if no one can resist his will?
Which is the exact question someone might ask upon hearing they are biologically determined. And what is Paul's response in Romans chapter 9, verses 14-24? He doesn't soften the blow or say, well, God looked down the corridors of time and saw what you would choose.
No, he doesn't.
He leans all the way in. He says, is there injustice on God's part? By no means. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy.
It's a profoundly humbling doctrine. And Paul continues in that passage to use the analogy of the potter and the clay. The clay cannot speak back to the potter and demand to know why it was made for a specific purpose. True freedom, in the biblical sense, is entirely compatible with God's sovereign decree.
Yeah.
You see this theological thread running unbroken through the works of Augustine, Martin Luther in his foundational book, The Bondage of the Will, and John Calvin.
Yeah, Calvin talked about this a lot.
They recognize that humanity, in its fallen state, is spiritually dead. We always act according to our greatest desires, but because of the fall, our desires are fundamentally bound to rebellion against God. We require the regenerating power of the Holy Spirit to change our core desires so that we willingly, freely, and joyfully run to Christ.
C.S. Lewis captured the subjective feeling of this compatibilist reality perfectly when describing his own conversion.
Oh, I love this quote.
He wrote about the moment he finally submitted to God, saying, I chose to open, to unbuckle, to loosen the rein. I say I chose, yet it did not really seem possible to do the opposite.
That's exactly it.
He recognized that God was doing the ultimate determining work of drawing him, but Lewis was fully consciously engaged in the choosing.
Right.
He did what he most desired to do in that moment because God had given him a new heart with new desires.
Exactly. So Sickler's point is brilliant here. If the neuroscience of Libet and others dictates a compatibilist view of human action, Orthodox Christianity is completely untroubled by it. We already hold to a robust compatibilism governed by a good, personal, sovereign God, rather than blind, impersonal physics.
But wait, if God is meticulously sovereign over my choices, haven't we just traded biological determinism for theological determinism? I'm still not the one driving the car, right? So why does having a soul matter in this debate?
That's a great question.
Because what if someone listening does firmly believe in libertarian free will? What if they genuinely believe humans have that independent, stop-or-go power of contrary choice?
That is the crux of Sickler's philosophical trap for the materialist.
Okay, lay the trap.
If you believe in libertarian free will, if you believe human beings actually have the power to initiate an uncaused action, the only way it can possibly exist is if we possess an immaterial soul that sits completely outside the chain of physical cause and effect.
Because a machine can't make a choice.
Right. A biological machine governed strictly by the laws of physics cannot, by definition, have libertarian freedom. A machine only does what its programming and the physical laws dictate. Only a soul, standing apart from physical determinism, can make a truly libertarian choice.
So it's a win-win for the Christian worldview.
Yes.
If cognitive science pushes us toward determinism and compatibilism, the historical Christian framework of God's sovereignty accounts for it beautifully. But if our daily human experience of choice demands libertarian freedom, the Christian anthropology of the soul provides the only metaphysical grounds for it to exist.
Either way, the Christian worldview offers a coherent foundation, while naturalistic materialism leaves you as a mere biomechanical puppet.
It is an incredibly strong position.
Yeah.
But if we follow the materialist premise further, it leads to an even deeper crisis. If materialist determinism is true, and we are just primates driven by blind, unguided evolutionary forces, how can we possibly trust the very scientific reasoning that led the scientists to these conclusions in the first place?
This moves us into Chapter 9, exploring reason, science, and the absolute self-defeating nature of naturalism.
Let's look at science itself, because we often treat science as this objective, foundationless truth generator. But science relies on massive, unprovable presuppositions, doesn't it?
It relies entirely on borrowed capital. In order to do science at all, you have to assume the uniformity of nature. You have to trust that gravity will work the exact same way on Tuesday as it did on Monday.
Which you can't prove until Tuesday happens.
Exactly. You have to assume the basic reliability of your sensory organs. You have to assume the existence of immaterial, universal laws of logic and mathematics. But here is the catch. Science cannot prove any of its own foundations. You cannot use a scientific experiment to prove that the scientific method is a valid way to find truth. That is circular reasoning.
Right. You can't put the laws of logic in a test tube. You need a robust philosophical and theological foundation to ground the scientific method. C.S. Lewis had a brilliant, vivid analogy for the absurdity of expecting truth from a purely materialist universe.
I love Lewis's analogies.
He said that trusting an unguided, randomly evolved brain to find absolute, objective truth is like upsetting a milk jug and hoping the splash gives you an accurate map of London.
That's so good.
It's utterly absurd. A random splash of milk has no intention, no design, and no alignment with reality.
Even Charles Darwin himself was deeply haunted by this implication. He called it his horrid doubt.
His horrid doubt.
Yeah, in a letter he wrote, "With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there were any convictions in such a mind?"
Wow, Darwin realized that if his brain was just an adaptation for primate survival, aimed at finding food and avoiding predators, he had absolutely no reason to trust it for discovering universal, objective truth about the cosmos.
Right. And the Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga took Darwin's horrid doubt and formalized it into a devastating philosophical critique called the evolutionary argument against naturalism, or the EAA.
Okay, let's really break down how Plantinga structures this argument, because it is brilliant.
Plantinga asks us to look at the mechanism of evolution. Evolution, by definition, only selects for survival and reproduction, not for truth. Natural selection is completely blind to whether a belief is objectively true or false. It only cares whether a belief generates behavior that keeps the organism alive long enough to pass on its genes.
Okay, give me an example of how a completely false belief could help an organism survive.
Plantinga uses the famous analogy of a prehistoric hominid. Let's call him Paul. Paul lives in a dangerous environment filled with hungry tigers. Paul has a belief. He thinks that the tiger is a cuddly, friendly pet, and he really wants to pet it.
Okay, terrible belief.
Right. However, he also has a secondary belief. He believes that the best way to pet the tiger is to run away from it as fast as humanly possible.
So his core belief about the tiger is 100% false. He is totally deluded about reality.
Exactly. His belief is completely false. But what behavior does that false belief produce? He runs away. And because he runs away, he survives. He doesn't get eaten. Evolution rewards the running away behavior and thus preserves the false belief that generated it. Evolution doesn't care that Paul is living in a fantasy world as long as his fantasy keeps him alive.
So apply that to us. If our brains evolved solely by naturalistic, unguided processes, our cognitive faculties are aimed entirely at survival, not at discovering truth.
Right.
Therefore, the naturalist has a built-in defeater for their own cognitive faculties. If you genuinely believe your brain is just a survival engine cobbled together by blind mutations, you have zero philosophical justification to trust any of its complex conclusions, including the conclusion that naturalism and evolution are true. You literally shoot your own worldview in the foot.
Precisely. If naturalism is true, there is no reason to trust the human mind. The worldview cannibalizes itself. It destroys the very foundation of reason and scientific inquiry. But as Sickler points out in the book, it gets even darker. Naturalism doesn't just destroy reason, it absolutely devastates morality.
It vaporizes the very concept of right and wrong. I want to set the stage here with Friedrich Nietzsche.
Oh, Nietzsche.
Yeah, in the late 19th century, he wrote the famous parable of the madman. The madman runs through the marketplace with a lantern in the morning, screaming, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him." Modern people often quote that triumphantly, as if humanity has finally grown up and thrown off the shackles of religion.
But Nietzsche wasn't celebrating.
Not at all. He was terrified. He realized that if the Western world abandoned God, they were wiping away the entire horizon. He asked, is there any up or down left? Are we not straying us through an infinite nothing? He knew that without the Christian God, there is a terrifying moral void. There is no ultimate justice. There's only the survival of the fittest and the will to power.
And this brings us to one of my favorite illustrations in Sickler's book, the story of the squirrels in his backyard. It perfectly captures the moral bankruptcy of naturalism.
Yes. Sickler squirrels. Tell that story.
So Sickler spends time observing the squirrels in his yard, and he notices two distinct populations. He has eastern gray squirrels, and they are generally cooperative. They share the trees, they tolerate each other's presence, and they thrive by essentially being nice to one another.
Sounds peaceful.
It is. But then he has American red squirrels. The red squirrels are highly aggressive. They attack the grays, they chase them away, they aggressively hoard the resources, and they thrive by being mean. Now, if we look at this from a purely evolutionary naturalistic standpoint, which squirrel is morally better?
From a purely evolutionary standpoint, neither. They both survive. Evolution doesn't care if you are nice and cooperative or mean and aggressive as long as you successfully pass on your genes to the next generation.
Exactly. Evolution is morally blind. It is just a descriptive mechanism of survival. It has no prescriptive moral voice. It cannot say thou shalt not. So if human beings are just highly evolved animals, on what basis can we say that our altruism, our compassion, or our care for the weak is objectively good, while violence, dominance, and selfishness are objectively evil?
We can't.
Nature has no category for good and evil. When a male lion takes over a pride and kills all the cubs sired by the previous male, he isn't committing murder. He's just practicing biology.
So by what standard do we judge human behavior? I really want to push back on some modern secular philosophers here, like Eric Wielenberg. Wielenberg recognizes this glaring problem. He looks at evolution and says, yes, human beings have inherited a heart of darkness from our evolutionary past. We have aggressive, selfish instincts.
Right, he admits the problem.
And he argues that we must use our advanced neuroscience and our intellect to tame the inner beast. He says we have to actively fight our savage instincts in order to be moral. But my question to Wielenberg is, by what standard?
That is the exact right question to ask. If survival and passing on genes is the only actual law of the natural universe, why is altruism better than violence? Why should I suppress my will to power if dominating others gets me what I want?
Wielenberg is essentially smuggling in borrowed capital from the Christian worldview. He is using historical, biblical morality concepts like loving your neighbor and protecting the weak to judge evolutionary outcomes. But you can't do that if God doesn't exist. If God doesn't exist, taming the inner beast is just an arbitrary preference. It's no more objectively true than preferring vanilla ice cream over chocolate.
You cannot ground objective morality in a universe of swirling atoms. Without a transcendent lawgiver, there is no moral law. You just have differing cultural preferences and evolutionary strategies. But the reality is everyone does know there is an objective moral law.
Deep down, they know it.
The secular philosophers know it too, which is why they tie themselves in academic knots trying to justify it without God. They feel the weight of moral duty. The Bible explains exactly why they feel it, even while denying the God who gave it.
This brings us to Romans chapter 2.
Yes. In Romans chapter 2, verses 14 to 15, the Apostle Paul writes something profound about human nature. He says that even the Gentiles, who do not have the written law of God, do by nature things required by the law.
Why is that?
Paul explains. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness. This is why true biblical counseling, for instance, is so effective. It recognizes that the Word of God is entirely sufficient for soul care because it speaks directly to the conscience that God himself installed in every single human being.
Right.
We don't need secular ideologies or evolutionary psychology to figure out the root of human behavior. The designer has already given us the manual, and he has stamped his moral character on our very souls.
God's law is written on the human heart. Nature without God is utterly valueless. But we aren't just nature. We are creatures made by a creator. But this perfectly transitions us to section 4 of Sickler's argument, knowing God.
Yes, epistemology.
We've seen that naturalism destroys the foundations for both reason and morality. It leaves you in an epistemological black hole. So the listener is probably asking, how do we actually know anything for sure, especially something as profound as the existence of God?
This brings us into the realm of epistemology, the philosophical study of knowledge. How do we distinguish between just believing something on a whim and actually knowing it to be true? A very aggressive, prominent stance in the modern secular world is championed by biologists like Jerry Coyne.
Okay, what does Coyne say?
He pushes what we can call the public confirmation criterion, which is the bedrock of scientism. Coyne argues that the only things that count as true, valid knowledge are publicly confirmable facts. Essentially, if science can't prove it, verify it, and repeat it in a controlled lab environment, it isn't real knowledge. It's just a fairy tale or a subjective feeling.
But this is an absurdly narrow, self-defeating view of reality, and Sickler easily debunks it with a brilliant thought experiment.
The fiddler on the roof test?
Exactly. Let's call it the fiddler on the roof test. Imagine you woke up this morning, you were alone in your kitchen making coffee, and you were humming the song Sunrise Sunset from Fiddler on the Roof. You know with absolute 100% certainty that you hummed that tune.
I know I did.
But think about it. That event cannot be publicly confirmed. It cannot be repeated in a lab. It cannot be falsified by a peer-reviewed double-blind study. According to Jerry Coyne's strict scientific criterion, you don't actually know what you hummed this morning. The fact that his rule forces you to deny your own undeniable conscious experience proves his criterion is functionally broken.
It is entirely broken. Scientism relies on an older philosophical system called foundationalism. Foundationalism is the strict rule that says you can only truly know things that fit into two categories. They must either be self-evident, like a basic math equation, like 2 + 2 = 4, or they must be proven by the 5 physical senses.
Okay, so self-evident or senses.
Right. If a belief doesn't fit into one of those two buckets, you are irrational for holding it. But as the Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga so masterfully points out, foundationalism is entirely self-defeating.
Oh, this is the absolute best part of the philosophical takedown. Walk us through exactly how Plantinga destroys foundationalism.
Plantinga does something very simple. He just applies the rule of foundationalism to itself. The rule is, you can only know something if it is self-evident or proven by the senses. Plantinga asks a devastating question. Is that very rule self-evident?
And the answer is no. It's not a mathematical tautology. It's a complex philosophical claim.
Exactly. Then he asks, can that very rule be proven by the senses? No, you can't taste, touch, smell, or put a philosophical rule under a microscope. Therefore, according to its own strict, self-imposed criteria, foundationalism cannot be known to be true. It cuts off the very branch it is sitting on. It is a completely invalid, arbitrary way to limit human knowledge.
It's like a guy holding up a sign that says, all signs are lying. The statement destroys itself. And when you realize that scientism and foundationalism are self-defeating, it opens the door for a much more robust, realistic way of understanding how we know things.
Plantinga calls this reformed epistemology.
Yes, and this framework is deeply rooted in historical biblical theology.
It is. Reformed epistemology argues that there are many beliefs we hold that are properly basic. A properly basic belief is one you hold rationally and justifiably, without needing a chain of external scientific proof or logical deduction to prop it up.
Like what?
For instance, the belief that the universe is older than 5 minutes. You can't scientifically prove the universe wasn't created 5 minutes ago with the illusion of age and implanted memories. Or the belief that other people actually have consciousness and aren't just highly sophisticated biological robots. You can't prove those things in a lab, but you are entirely rational to believe them. They are properly basic to the human experience. And John Calvin, the 16th century reformer, argued forcefully that knowledge of God is exactly this kind of properly basic belief.
Right. Calvin talked about the sensus divinitatis, which translates to a natural sense of the divine. He argued that God hardwired an internal faculty into the human soul specifically designed to know the Creator. We don't deduce God like a math problem. We perceive him because we were built to.
Exactly. And Calvin didn't invent this concept. It is robustly biblical. It's the doctrine of general revelation. The Apostle Paul writes in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 to 22, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So they are without excuse."
That passage is so foundational. It tells us that people do not lack evidence for God. That is the great lie of the secular age, that there just isn't enough proof. The biblical diagnosis is entirely different. People have the evidence, it is plainly perceived, but they actively suppress the truth in unrighteousness because they love their sin and do not want to be accountable to a holy God.
The problem isn't intellectual, it's moral.
King David echoes this exact reality in Psalm chapter 19, verses 1-4. The heavens proclaim the glory of God. The skies display his craftsmanship. Day after day they continue to speak. Night after night they make him known. They speak without a sound or word, their voice is never heard, yet their message has gone throughout the earth. God has spoken clearly, undeniably, through his creation. Belief in him is properly basic.
And this is where cognitive science actually steps in and provides incredible confirming data for the biblical worldview.
Really? How so?
There is an entire field called the cognitive science of religion, or CSR. And the research in CSR actually confirms that human beings are naturally biologically hardwired for religious belief. From a very young age, we have cognitive faculties that naturally detect agency, purpose, and design in the world around us.
Now, atheists look at this CSR data and try to spin it to fit their naturalistic narrative, right? They say, aha. You see, religion is just an evolutionary survival trick. Your brain developed a hyperactive agency detection device to keep you safe from predators in the jungle, and now it's misfiring and making you believe in invisible gods. Your brain is just playing tricks on you to help your tribe survive.
They do say that. But Sickler logically flips this right back on them in a devastating way.
How does he flip it?
Well, if the atheist is going to dismiss the human brain's religious faculties as mere evolutionary survival tricks, misfires of the cerebral cortex, they must, to be intellectually honest, dismiss their atheistic and skeptical reasoning faculties as well.
Oh, because according to their own worldview, those skeptical faculties evolved by the exact same blind, unguided process.
Exactly. If you can't trust the brain when it universally points to God, you have no grounds to trust it when it points to atheism. Ultimately, Sickler argues that the findings of cognitive science find their most coherent, intellectually satisfying home inside the Christian framework.
Because God designed our brains to know him.
Yes. He gave us the sensus divinitatis, the fact that our brains light up with religious belief, the fact that we naturally perceive design isn't an evolutionary accident or a misfiring survival mechanism. It is the masterpiece of a creator who deeply desires to be known by his creatures.
What a massive, sweeping journey we have been on today. We started by looking at that murky fMRI scan, asking the cultural question, is science slowly squeezing the soul out of existence? But as Sickler demonstrates, far from eliminating the soul, rigorous cognitive science and deep philosophy actually expose the catastrophic failures of materialism.
They really do.
When you examine the hard problem of consciousness, you see that physical matter simply cannot explain the subjective human experience. When you look at the metaphysics of free will, you realize that strict materialism reduces humanity to mere biomechanical puppets, while the biblical worldview perfectly and beautifully harmonizes God's sovereign decree with genuine human responsibility.
And when you look at the impossibility of grounding objective morality in a blind, violent evolutionary process and the self-defeating nature of secular epistemology that actually destroys the foundation of science itself, the picture becomes incredibly clear. Sickler's argument is that the Christian worldview, anchored in an inspired scripture and trusting in the historical reality of the triune God, provides the only coherent foundation for understanding reality.
It is the only worldview that actually gives you permission to trust your own mind.
It truly is. Which leads me to a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over as you go about your day.
Okay, let's hear it.
Think about this. If your brain was truly just a biomechanical machine, blindly reacting to the unbending laws of physics, you wouldn't even possess the free will required to change your mind about anything we discussed today. You wouldn't be thinking at all. You would just be chemically reacting to stimuli. The very fact that you are pondering these concepts, weighing the philosophical evidence, and actively seeking the truth is perhaps the greatest empirical proof that you are far more than just chemistry.
You are a soul beautifully woven into a body, designed by a sovereign and loving God to seek him and know him. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We invite you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep marveling at the incredible design of the human mind. Until next time.